Among history's most remarkable figures, Edward III was born on November 13, 1312, at Windsor Castle in Berkshire, England. His father, Edward II, had become the King of England in 1307 when he was just 23 years old. Edward II's reign was filled with challenges, and many in England were not happy with how he ruled. His father, Edward I, had been known as Edward Longshanks and was famous for his strong leadership. He had expanded England's power by conquering Wales and intervening in Scotland. However, after Edward I's death, the kingdom faced troubles, and many people thought that his son, Edward II, was not strong enough to keep things under control. Edward III's mother, Isabella, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France. She grew up in France, and when she married Edward II in January 1308, she was only 12 years old. Their marriage marked the start of many difficult years in Edward II's rule. When Edward III was born, England was facing a lot of problems. The country was in a time of instability after the death of Edward I, and his son, Edward II, struggled to manage the kingdom. Edward II gave too much power to a few favorites, which made many of the nobles unhappy. One of these favorites, Piers Gaveston, was given a lot of power, and the nobles soon got rid of him. The situation did not improve, and England also faced a big defeat in Scotland at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Edward III grew up during these troubled times, though as a child, he was not aware of the political struggles around him. His early years were spent at a royal household separate from his parents, where he was likely raised by tutors and learned the skills needed to be a future king. Edward II became King of England after the death of his father, Edward I, in 1307. He was just 23 years old at the time and was immediately faced with a difficult situation. Unlike his father, who had been a strong leader, Edward II struggled to maintain control over the kingdom. His reign was marked by political instability, as he often relied on a few favorites to help him govern, which angered the English nobility. One of these favorites, Piers Gaveston, was particularly controversial. Edward's close relationship with Gaveston led to resentment from the nobles, who felt that the king was giving him too much power. The situation worsened in the early years of Edward II's reign. In the year 1314, the English army suffered a major defeat in Scotland at the Battle of Bannockburn. This loss was a significant blow to English authority in Scotland and made many of the nobility question Edward II's ability to rule effectively. His reign became increasingly unpopular, and in the years that followed, tensions between the king and the nobles continued to rise. Amid this turmoil, young Edward III, who was only a child, was positioned to inherit the throne. At the time of his birth in 1312, his future as king was uncertain, as his father's reign was not going well. However, as the political instability continued to grow, it became clear that Edward III would eventually take the throne. His mother, Isabella, played a key role in the downfall of Edward II's reign. She, along with Roger Mortimer, led a rebellion against Edward II and forced him to abdicate in favor of their young son in January 1327. After Edward II was forced to abdicate in January 1327, his son, Edward III, was proclaimed King of England at just 14 years old. However, Edward III was not able to rule on his own at first. His mother, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, took control of the kingdom. Although Edward III held the title of King, Isabella and Mortimer were the ones in charge. This caused tension and dissatisfaction among many of the nobles, who felt that their young king was being controlled by others. As a result, the reign of Edward III started with political unrest. Isabella and Mortimer's power was challenged by a group of English lords who were unhappy with their rule. In 1330, the nobles, led by the powerful Earl of Lancaster, began to rise up against the government, hoping to regain control and reduce the influence of Mortimer and Isabella. This rebellion was an important moment in Edward III's early years as king, as it was one of the first signs that the nobles were willing to fight for power. By the following year, Isabella and Mortimer had lost their grip on power. In October 1330, Edward III took action against Mortimer. With the help of his supporters, he arrested Mortimer, and by November, Mortimer was executed. Edward III was now fully in charge of England, and the political turmoil that had defined his early reign finally came to an end. Edward III officially became King of England in January 1327, following the forced abdication of his father, Edward II. Although he was only 14 years old at the time, his reign marked a turning point in English history. At first, his mother, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, held most of the power. While they ruled in his name, Edward III was largely a figurehead. However, as he grew older, he began to show that he was capable of ruling on his own. In 1330, after 3 years of being controlled by Isabella and Mortimer, Edward III decided it was time to take control. He led a rebellion to reclaim his authority and remove Mortimer from power. Edward, with the support of his loyal followers, succeeded in arresting Mortimer in October 1330. Mortimer was soon executed, and Isabella's influence was greatly reduced. This marked the beginning of Edward's full reign as king. Once he took control, Edward III proved himself to be a strong leader. He pushed forward with his plans to restore and expand English power. His reign would go on to be one of the most significant in English history, with achievements in both domestic governance and military conquest. He restored the monarchy's authority and began to solidify England's position in Europe through strategic alliances and military campaigns, which would eventually lead to the start of the 100 Years' War. Once Edward III had secured his position as king, he turned his attention to the challenges facing England, both at home and abroad. His early reign was marked by a determination to strengthen England's power, especially in relation to France and Scotland. Edward's foreign policy was driven by the ongoing tensions between England and France, particularly regarding the English claims to French territories. One of Edward's most significant military moves came in the year 1331, when he began to assert England's influence in Scotland. Following the death of the Scottish King Robert the Bruce, Scotland was thrown into a period of instability. Edward saw this as an opportunity to assert control over the northern kingdom and to reclaim English influence. He led several military campaigns against the Scots, which were part of his broader strategy to reassert English dominance in the region. However, it was his dealings with France that would define much of his foreign policy in the early years of his reign. Edward III's claim to the French throne was a key factor in his diplomatic relations with France. His mother, Isabella, was the daughter of King Philip IV of France, which gave Edward a legitimate claim to the French crown. This claim became a source of tension between the two nations. Edward, eager to expand England's influence, pursued this claim aggressively, leading to the start of the 100 Years' War. In the early stages of the war, Edward focused on building alliances with other European powers to strengthen England's position. He secured important alliances with the Low Countries and Germany, which provided military and logistical support. These alliances would prove critical as Edward sought to challenge French dominance in Europe and establish England as a major power on the continent. The 100 Years' War, which began in the year 1339, was one of the most important conflicts of Edward III's reign. This war was primarily fought between England and France over control of French territories and the English claim to the French throne. Edward III's claim, based on his descent from Philip IV of France, was not accepted by the French nobility, leading to a bitter struggle that would last for over a century. One of the early key battles in the war was the Battle of Sluys in 1340. This naval victory was a significant turning point for Edward III as it gave England control of the English Channel and greatly weakened the French navy. The victory at Sluys allowed Edward to launch a series of raids along the northern French coast and further strengthened England's military presence in Europe. Following the victory at Sluys, Edward shifted his focus to land campaigns in France. The Battle of Crécy, fought in August 1346, was another decisive moment in the war. In this battle, Edward's army, though smaller, was able to defeat the much larger French force, largely due to the use of the longbow, which proved devastating against the French cavalry. The success at Crécy cemented Edward's reputation as a brilliant military strategist and established the longbow as a powerful weapon in European warfare. Another major success came with the Siege of Calais in 1347. After a long and difficult siege, the town of Calais finally surrendered to Edward. The capture of Calais gave England a crucial stronghold in France, which would remain under English control for over 2 centuries. These early victories in the war helped to solidify Edward's power and brought significant territorial gains for England. As Edward III continued to strengthen England's military presence abroad, he also worked to address domestic issues, which became especially urgent during the outbreak of the Black Death. The bubonic plague arrived in Europe in the year 1347, spreading quickly across the continent and eventually reaching England in the summer of 1348. The disease caused widespread devastation, killing as much as a third of the population, and had severe social and economic effects on the kingdom. In response to the Black Death, Edward took swift action to manage the labor shortage that resulted from so many deaths. In the year 1349, he issued the Ordinance of Laborers, which set wage levels and attempted to prevent workers from demanding higher wages due to the shortage of labor. The following year, in 1351, Edward passed the Statute of Laborers, a more formal law that reinforced wage controls and restricted the movement of workers to prevent them from seeking better pay in different regions. These actions were aimed at stabilizing the economy and ensuring that labor remained available for the farming and industry that was critical to England's economy. While these laws were meant to restore order, they were not entirely effective and led to some unrest among workers who were unhappy with the restrictions. Despite this, Edward's reforms helped to prevent the collapse of the economy in the aftermath of the plague. Additionally, the king continued to focus on strengthening England's military and governmental systems during this difficult time. By the late years of Edward III's reign, the king began to face significant challenges that would mark the decline of his power. As he grew older, Edward's health began to deteriorate, and he suffered from various ailments, including what is believed to have been a series of strokes. His ability to govern became increasingly limited, and by the time the 1370s arrived, Edward's role in the day-to-day affairs of the kingdom was largely taken over by his sons, especially his eldest son, Edward, known as the Black Prince. Edward III's reign, which had been marked by military triumphs, economic reforms, and territorial gains, was now facing the consequences of years of war and heavy financial burdens. The 100 Years' War, which had been started in his early reign, continued to drain resources. Despite these struggles, Edward's legacy remained strong. His reign had brought England to the height of its medieval power, with victories in key battles like Crécy and Poitiers and the capture of Calais, all of which expanded English influence in France and cemented Edward's reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history. Even in his final years, Edward's legacy endured. His policies on governance, including the increased role of Parliament and reforms in England's legal and economic systems, left a lasting impact. His efforts to stabilize the country during the Black Death also helped England navigate through one of the most challenging periods in its history. What do you think about Edward III's reign? Do you consider him one of England's greatest kings? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical insights. Your support helps us bring more amazing stories to life. Thank you very much for watching.